And I insist on it because a Waldensian may be burned after the accidents of a Catharist have been attributed to him, and vice versa. And when you burn a man, you burn his individual substance and reduce to pure nothing that which was a concrete act of existing, hence in itself good, at least in the eyes of God, who kept him in existence. Does this seem to you a good reason for insisting on the differences? The trouble is, I said, I can no longer distinguish the accidental difference among Waldensians, Catharists, the poor of Lyons, the Umiliati, the Begards, Joachimites, Patarines, Apostles, poor Lombards, Arnoldists, Williamites, followers of the free spirit, and Luciferines. What am I to do? Oh, poor Adza, William said, laughing and giving me an affectionate slap on the nape, you're not really wrong. You see, it's as if, over the last 2 centuries, and even earlier, this world of ours had been struck by storms of intolerance, hope, and despair, all together. No, that's not a good analogy. Imagine a river, wide and majestic, which flows for miles and miles between strong embankments, where the land is firm. At a certain point, the river, out of weariness, because its flow has taken up too much time and too much space, because it is approaching the sea, which annihilates all rivers in itself, no longer knows what it is, loses its identity. It becomes its own delta. A major branch may remain, but many break off from it in every direction, and some flow together again, into one another, and you can't tell what begets what, and sometimes you can't tell what is still river and what is already sea. If I understand your allegory, the river is the city of God, or the kingdom of the just, which is approaching the millennium, and in this uncertainty it no longer remains secure, false and true prophets are born, and everything flows into the great plain where Armageddon will take place. That isn't exactly what I was thinking. I was trying to explain to you how the body of the church, which for centuries was also the body of all society, the people of God, has become too rich and wide, and it carries along the dross of all the countries it has passed through, and it has lost its own purity. The branches of the delta are, if you like, so many attempts of the river to flow as quickly as possible to the sea, that is, to the moment of purification. My allegory was meant only to tell you how the branches of heresy and the movements of renewal, when the river is no longer intact, are numerous and become mingled. You can also add to my poor allegory the image of someone who is trying to reconstruct the banks of the river with brute strength, but cannot do so. And some branches of the delta silt up, others are redirected to the river by artificial channels, still others are allowed to flow, because it is impossible to restrain everything, and it is better for the river to lose a part of its water and still maintain its course, if it wants to have a recognizable course. I understand less and less. So do I am not good at speaking in parables. Forget this story of the river. Try instead to understand that many of the movements you mentioned were born at least 200 years ago and are already dead, yet others are recent. But when heretics are discussed, they are all mentioned together. True, and this is one of the ways heresy spreads and one of the ways it is destroyed. Again, I don't understand. God, how difficult it is. Very well. Imagine you are a reformer of morals and you collect some companions on a mountaintop to live in poverty. And after a while you see that many come to you, even from distant lands, and they consider you a prophet or a new apostle, and they follow you. Have they really come there for you or for what you say? I don't know. I hope so. Why otherwise? Because from their fathers they have heard stories of other reformers and legends of more or less perfect communities, and they believe this is that and that is this. And so every movement inherits the offspring of others? Of course, because the majority of those who flock after reformers are the simple, who have no subtlety of doctrine. And yet moral reform movements originate in different places and ways and with different doctrines. For example, the Catharists and the Waldensians are often mixed up. But there is a great difference between them. The Waldensians preached a moral reform within the church, the Catharists preached a different church, a different view of God and morality. The Catharists thought the world was divided between the opposing forces of good and evil, and they had built a church in which the perfect were distinguished from simple believers, and they had their sacraments and their rites. They had built a very rigid hierarchy, almost like that of our own Holy Mother, and they didn't for a moment think of destroying every form of power. Which explains to you why men in command, landowners, feudal lords, also joined the Catharists. Nor did they think of reforming the world, because the opposition between good and evil for them can never be settled. The Waldensians, on the contrary, and along with them the Arnoldists, or poor Lombards, wanted to construct a different world on an ideal of poverty, and this is why they received the outcasts and lived in community with the labor of their hands. But why, then, are they confused and spoken of as the same evil weed? I told you. What makes them live is also what makes them die. The movements grow, gathering simple people who have been aroused by other movements and who believe all have the same impulse of revolt and hope, and they are destroyed by the inquisitors, who attribute to one the errors of the other, and if the sectarians of one movement commit a crime, this crime will be attributed to each sectarian of each movement. The inquisitors are mistaken, rationally speaking, because they lump contradictory doctrines together. They are right, according to others' irrationality, because when a movement of, say, Arnoldists springs up in one city, it is swelled by those who would have been or have been Catharists or Waldensians elsewhere. Fra Dolcino's apostles preached the physical destruction of clerics and lords, and committed many acts of violence. The Waldensians are opposed to violence, and so are the Fraticelli. But I am sure that in Fra Dolcino's day there were many in his group who had previously followed the preachings of the Fraticelli or the Waldensians. The simple cannot choose their personal heresy, adza. They cling to the man preaching in their land, who passes through their village or stops in their square. This is what their enemies exploit. To present to the eyes of the people a single heresy, which perhaps may suggest at the same time the renunciation of sexual pleasure and the communion of bodies, is good preaching technique. It shows the heretics as one jumble of diabolical contradictions which offend common sense. So there is no relationship among them, and it is the devil's deception that makes a simple man who would like to be a Joachimite or a spiritual fall into the hands of the Catharists, and vice versa? No, that is not quite it. Let's try again from the beginning, adza. But I assure you, I am attempting to explain to you something about which I myself am not sure I possess the truth. I think the mistake is to believe that the heresy comes first, and then the simple folk who join it, and damn themselves for it. Actually, first comes the condition of being simple, then the heresy. What do you mean? You have a clear conception of the people of God. A great flock, good sheep and bad sheep, kept in order by mastiffs, the warriors, or the temporal power, the emperor, and the overlords, under the guidance of the shepherds, the clerics, the interpreters of the divine word. The picture is straightforward, but false. The shepherds fight with the dogs, because each covets the rights of the other. True, and this is exactly what makes the nature of the flock unsure. Concerned as they are with tearing each other apart reciprocally, dogs and shepherds no longer tend the flock. A part of it is left outside. What do you mean by outside? On the margin. Peasants. Only they are not really peasants, because they have no land, or what land they have does not feed them. And citizens. Only they are not citizens, because they do not belong to a guild or a corporation. They are the little people, prey of anyone. Have you sometimes seen groups of lepers in the countryside? Yes, once I saw 100 together. Misshapen, their flesh decaying and all whitish, hobbling on their crutches, with swollen eyelids, bleeding eyes. They didn't speak or shout, they twittered, like mice. For the Christian people they are the others, those who remain on the fringe of the flock. The flock hates them, they hate the flock, who wish all lepers like them would die. Yes, I recall a story about King Mark, who had to condemn Isolde the Beautiful and was about to have her ascend the stake when the lepers came and said to the king that the stake was a mild punishment and that there was a worse one. And they cried to him, "Give us Isolde that she may belong to all of us, our illness inflames our desires, give her to your lepers. Look at our rags, glued to our groaning wounds. She, who at your side enjoyed rich stuffs lined with squirrel fur and jewels, when she sees the courtyard of the lepers, when she has to enter our hovels and lie with us, then she will truly recognize her sin and regret this fine pyre of brambles." I see that for a novice of Saint Benedict you have done some odd reading, William remarked. I blushed, because I knew a novice should not read romances, but they circulated among us young people in the monastery of Milk and we read them at night by candlelight. But that doesn't matter, William continued, you have understood what I meant. The outcast lepers would like to drag everything down in their ruin. And they become all the more evil, the more you cast them out, and the more you depict them as a court of lemures who want your ruin, the more they will be outcast. Saint Francis realized this, and his first decision was to go and live among the lepers. The people of God cannot be changed until the outcasts are restored to its body. But you were speaking of other outcasts, it isn't lepers who form heretical movements. The flock is like a series of concentric circles, from the broadest range of the flock to its immediate surroundings. The lepers are a sign of exclusion in general. Saint Francis understood that. He didn't want only to help the lepers, if he had, his act would have been reduced to quite a poor and impotent act of charity. He wanted to signify something else. Have you been told about his preaching to the birds? Oh, yes, I've heard that beautiful story, and I admired the saint who enjoyed the company of those tender creatures of God, I said with great fervor. Well, what they told you was mistaken, or rather, it's a story the order has revised today. When Francis spoke to the people of the city and its magistrates and saw they didn't understand him, he went out to the cemetery and began preaching to ravens and magpies, to hawks, to raptors feeding on corpses. What a horrible thing, I said. Then they were not good birds. They were birds of prey, outcast birds, like the lepers. Francis was surely thinking of that verse of the Apocalypse that says, I saw an angel standing in the sun, and he cried with a loud voice, saying to all the fowls that fly in the midst of heaven, Come and gather yourselves together at the supper of the great God. That ye may eat the flesh of kings, and the flesh of captains, and the flesh of mighty men, and the flesh of horses, and of them that sit on them, and the flesh of all men, both free and bond, both small and great. So Francis wanted to incite the outcasts to revolt? No, that was what Fra Dolcino and his followers wanted, if anybody did. Francis wanted to call the outcast, ready to revolt, to be part of the people of God. If the flock was to be gathered again, the outcasts had to be found again. Francis didn't succeed, and I say it with great bitterness. To recover the outcasts he had to act within the church, to act within the church he had to obtain the recognition of his rule, from which an order would emerge, and this order, as it emerged, would recompose the image of a circle, at whose margin the outcasts remain. So now do you understand why there are bands of Fraticelli and Joachimites who again gather the outcasts around themselves? But we weren't talking about Francis, we were talking about how heresy is produced by the simple and the outcast. Yes, we were talking about those excluded from the flock of sheep. For centuries, as Pope and Emperor tore each other apart in their quarrels over power, the excluded went on living on the fringe, like lepers, of whom true lepers are only the illustration ordained by God to make us understand this wondrous parable, so that in saying, lepers, we would understand. Outcast, poor, simple, excluded, uprooted from the countryside, humiliated in the cities. But we did not understand. The mystery of leprosy has continued to haunt us because we have not recognized the nature of the sign. Excluded as they were from the flock, all of them were ready to hear, or to produce, every sermon that, harking back to the word of Christ, would condemn the behavior of the dogs and shepherds and would promise their punishment one day. The powerful always realized this. The recovery of the outcasts demanded reduction of the privileges of the powerful, so the excluded who became aware of their exclusion had to be branded as heretics, whatever their doctrine. And for their part, blinded by their exclusion, they were not really interested in any doctrine. This is the illusion of heresy. Everyone is heretical, everyone is orthodox. The faith a movement proclaims doesn't count. What counts is the hope it offers. All heresies are the banner of a reality and exclusion. Scratch the heresy and you will find the leper. Every battle against heresy wants only this, to keep the leper as he is. As for the lepers, what can you ask of them? That they distinguish in the Trinitarian dogma or in the definition of the Eucharist how much is correct and how much is wrong. Come, Adza, these games are for us men of learning. The simple have other problems. And mind you, they solve them all in the wrong way. This is why they become heretics. But why do some people support them? Because it serves their purposes, which concern the faith rarely, and more often the conquest of power. Is that why the Church of Rome accuses all its adversaries of heresy? That is why, and that is also why it recognizes as orthodoxy any heresy it can bring back under its own control or must accept because the heresy has become too strong. But there is no precise rule, it depends on the individuals, on the circumstances. This holds true also for the secular lords. Sometimes the city magistrates encourage the heretics to translate the gospel into the vernacular. The vernacular by now is the language of the cities, Latin the language of Rome and the monasteries. And sometimes the magistrates support the Waldensians because they declare that all, men and women, lowly and mighty, can teach and preach, and the worker who is a disciple after 10 days hunts for another whose teacher he can become. And so they eliminate the distinction that makes clerics irreplaceable. But, then, why does it happen that the same city magistrates rebel against the heretics and lend the church a hand in having them burned? Because they realize the heretics' growth could jeopardize also the privileges of the laity who speak in the vernacular. In the Lateran Council of 1179, you see, these questions date back 150 years. Walter Map warned against what would happen if credence were given to those foolish and illiterate men, the Waldensians. He said, if I recall properly, that they have no fixed dwelling, they go about barefoot and possess nothing, holding everything as common property, following naked the naked Christ. They begin in this very humble way because they are outcasts, but if you give them too much room they will drive out everyone else. This is why the cities favored the mendicant orders, and as Franciscans in particular. We fostered a harmonious balance between the need for penance and the life of the city, between the church and the burghers, concerned for their trade. Was harmony achieved, then, between love of God and love of trade? No, the movements of spiritual renewal were blocked. They were channeled within the bounds of an order recognized by the Pope. But what circulated underneath was not channeled. It flowed, on the one hand, into the movements of the flagellants, who endanger no one, or into the armed bands like Fra Dolcino's, or into the witchcraft rituals of the monks of Montefalco that Uberdino was talking about. But who was right? Who was right? Who was wrong? I asked, bewildered. They were all right in their way, and all were mistaken. And you, I cried, in an access almost of rebellion, why don't you take a position? Why won't you tell me where the truth is? William remained silent for a while, holding the lens he was working on up to the light. Then he lowered it to the table and showed me, through the lens, a tool. Look, he said to me. What do you see? The tool, a bit larger. There. The most we can do is look more closely. But the tool remains always the same. The manuscript of Venantius, too, will remain the same when, thanks to this lens, I've been able to read it. But perhaps when I've read the manuscript I'll know a part of the truth better. And perhaps we'll be able to make the life of the abbey better. But that isn't enough. I'm saying more than I seem to be, Adza. This isn't the first time I've spoken to you of Roger Bacon. Perhaps he was not the wisest man of all time, but I've always been fascinated by the hope that inspired his love of learning. Bacon believed in the strength, the needs, the spiritual inventions of the simple. He wouldn't have been a good Franciscan if he hadn't thought that the poor, the outcast, idiots and illiterate, often speak with the mouth of our Lord. The simple have something more than do learned doctors, who often become lost in their search for broad, general laws. The simple have a sense of the individual, but this sense, by itself, is not enough. The simple grasp a truth of their own, perhaps truer than that of the doctors of the church, but then they destroy it in unthinking actions. What must be done? Give learning to the simple? Too easy, or too difficult? The Franciscan teachers considered this problem. The great Bonaventure said that the wise must enhance conceptual clarity with the truth implicit in the actions of the simple. Like the chapter of Perugia and the learned memories of Uberdino, which transform into theological decisions the summons of the simple to poverty, I said. Yes, but as you have seen, this happens too late, and when it happens, the truth of the simple has already been transformed into the truth of the powerful, more useful for the Emperor Louis than for a friar of the poor life. How are we to remain close to the experience of the simple, maintaining, so to speak, their operative virtue, the capacity of working toward the transformation and betterment of their world? This was the problem for Bacon. Quod enim laicali ruditate dirgesset non habet effectum nisi fortuita, he said. The experience of the simple has savage and uncontrollable results. Sed opera sapientiae certa lege valentur et infinem debitum efficacitor dirigundur. Which is to say that even in the handling of practical things, be they agriculture, mechanics, or the governing of a city, a kind of theology is required. He thought that the new natural science should be the great new enterprise of the learned, to coordinate, through a different knowledge of natural processes, the elementary needs that represented also the heap of expectations, disordered but in its way true and right, of the simple. The new science, the new natural magic. According to Bacon, this enterprise was to be directed by the church, but I believe he said this because in his time the community of clerics was identified with the community of the learned. Today that is no longer the case. Learned men grow up outside the monasteries and the cathedrals, even outside the universities. So I think that, since I and my friends today believe that for the management of human affairs it is not the church that should legislate but the assembly of the people, then in the future the community of the learned will have to propose this new and humane theology which is natural philosophy and positive magic. A splendid enterprise, I said, but is it possible? Bacon thought so. And you? I think so, too. But to believe in it we must be sure that the simple are right in possessing the sense of the individual, which is the only good kind. However, if the sense of the individual is the only good, how will science succeed in recomposing the universal laws through which, and interpreting which, the good magic will become functional? Yes, I said, how can it? I no longer know. I have had arguments at Oxford with my friend William of Ockham, who is now in Avignon. He has sown doubts in my mind. Because if only the sense of the individual is just, the proposition that identical causes have identical effects is difficult to prove. A single body can be cold or hot, sweet or bitter, wet or dry, in one place, and not in another place. How can I discover the universal bond that orders all things if I cannot lift a finger without creating an infinity of new entities? For with such a movement all the relations of position between my finger and all other objects change. The relations are the ways in which my mind perceives the connections between single entities, but what is the guarantee that this is universal and stable? But you know that a certain thickness of glass corresponds to a certain power of vision, and it is because you know this that now you can make lenses like the ones you have lost. Otherwise how could you? An acute reply, adza. In fact, I have worked out this proposition. Equal thickness corresponds necessarily to equal power of vision. I have posited it because on other occasions I have had individual insights of the same type. To be sure, anyone who tests the curative property of herbs knows that individual herbs of the same species have equal effects of the same nature on the patient, and therefore the investigator formulates the proposition that every herb of a given type helps the feverish, or that every lens of such a type magnifies the eye's vision to the same degree. The science Bacon spoke of rests unquestionably on these propositions. You understand, adza, I must believe that my proposition works, because I learned it by experience, but to believe it I must assume there are universal laws. Yet I cannot speak of them, because the very concept that universal laws and an established order exist would imply that God is their prisoner, whereas God is something absolutely free, so that if he wanted, with a single act of his will he could make the world different. And so, if I understand you correctly, you act, and you know why you act, but you don't know why you know that you know what you do. I must say with pride that William gave me a look of admiration. Perhaps that's it. In any case, this tells you why I feel so uncertain of my truth, even if I believe in it. You are more mystical than Uberdino. I said spitefully. Perhaps. But as you see, I work on things of nature. And in the investigation we are carrying out, I don't want to know who is good or who is wicked, but who was in the scriptorium last night, who took the eyeglasses, who left traces of a body dragging another body in the snow, and where Berengar is. These are facts. Afterward I'll try to connect them, if it's possible, for it's difficult to say what effect is produced by what cause. An angel's intervention would suffice to change everything, so it isn't surprising that one thing cannot be proved to be the cause of another thing. Even if one must always try, as I am doing. Yours is a difficult life, I said. But I found Brunellus, William cried, recalling the horse episode of 2 days before. Then there is an order in the world. I cried, triumphant. Then there is a bit of order in this poor head of mine, William answered. At this point Nicholas came back with an almost finished fork, holding it up victoriously. And when this fork is on my poor nose, William said, perhaps my poor head will be even more orderly. A novice came to say the abbot wished to see William, and was waiting for him in the garden. As we started off, William slapped his forehead, as if remembering only at this point something he had forgotten. By the way, he said, I've deciphered Venantius's Kabbalistic signs. All of them? When? While you were asleep. And it depends on what you mean by all. I've deciphered the signs that the flame caused to appear, the ones you copied out. The notes in Greek must wait till I have new lenses. Well, was it the secret of the Finis Africae? Yes, and the key was fairly easy. At his disposal Venantius had the 12 signs of the zodiac and 8 other signs, for the 5 planets, the 2 luminaries, and the Earth. 20 signs in all. Enough to associate with them the letters of the Latin alphabet, since you can use the same letter to express the sound of the 2 initials of unum and velet. The order of the letters, we know. What could be the order of the signs, then? I thought of the order of the heavens, placing the zodiacal quadrant at the far edge. So, then, Earth, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, etc., and, afterward, the signs of the zodiac in their traditional sequence, as Isidore of Seville classifies them, beginning with Aries and the vernal equinox, ending with Pisces. Now, if you try this key, Venantius's message takes on a meaning. He showed me the parchment, on which he had transcribed the message to big Latin letters, Secretum finis Africae manus supra idolum age primum et septimum dequaduor. Is that clear? He asked. The hand over the idol works on the 1st and the 7th of the 4. I repeated, shaking my head. It isn't clear at all. I know. First of all we have to know what Venantius meant by idolum. An image, a ghost, a figure? And then what can this 4 be that has a 1st and a 7th? And what is to be done with them? Move them, push them, pull them? So we know nothing and we are still where we started, I said, with great dismay. William stopped and looked at me with an expression not entirely benevolent. My boy, he said, you have before you a poor Franciscan who, with his modest learning and what little skill he owes to the infinite power of the Lord, has succeeded in a few hours in deciphering a secret code whose author was sure would prove sealed to all save himself, and you, wretched illiterate rogue, dare say we are still where we started. I apologized very clumsily. I had wounded my master's vanity, and yet I knew how proud he was of the speed and accuracy of his deductions. William truly had performed a job worthy of admiration, and it was not his fault if the crafty Venantius not only had concealed his discovery behind an obscure zodiacal alphabet, but had further devised an undecipherable riddle. No matter, don't apologize, William interrupted me. After all, you're right. We still know too little. Come along. Vespers. In which the abbot speaks again with the visitors, and William has some astounding ideas for deciphering the riddle of the labyrinth and succeeds in the most rational way. Then William and Adza eat cheese and batter. The abbot was waiting for us with a grim, worried look. He was holding a paper in his hand. I have just received a letter from the abbot of Conques, he said. He discloses the name of the man to whom John has entrusted the command of the French soldiers and the responsibility for the safety of the legation. He is not a man of arms, he is not a man of the court, and he will be at the same time a member of the legation. A rare combination of different qualities, William said uneasily. Who is it? Bernard Guay, or Bernardo Guidoni, whichever you choose to call him. William made an ejaculation in his own language that I didn't understand, nor did the abbot understand it, and perhaps it was best for us both, because the word William uttered had an obscene hissing sound. I don't like this, he added at once. For years Bernard was the scourge of heretics in the Toulouse area, and he has written a Practica Officii Inquisitionis Heredis Pravitatis for the use of those who must persecute and destroy Waldensians, Bigards, Fraticelli, and Dulcinians. I know. I am familiar with the book, remarkably learned. Remarkably learned, William conceded. He's devoted to John, who in recent years has assigned him many missions in Flanders and here in northern Italy. And even when he was named Bishop of Galicia, he was never seen in his diocese but continued his activity as inquisitor. I thought he had now retired to the bishopric of Lodève, but apparently John is recalling him to duty, right here in northern Italy. But why Bernard, of all people, and why with a command of soldiers? There is an answer, the abbot said, and it confirms all the fears I expressed to you yesterday. You know well, even if you will not admit it to me, that the positions on the poverty of Christ and of the Church sustained by the chapter of Perugia, though supported by an abundance of theological arguments, are the same ones that many heretical movements sustain, much less prudently and in a much less orthodox fashion. It does not take much to demonstrate that the positions of Michael of Cesena, espoused by the emperor, are the same as those of Ubertino and Angelus Clarinus. And up to this point, the 2 legations will concur. But Guay could do more, and he has the skill. He will try to insist that the theses of Perugia are the same as those of the Fraticelli, or the pseudo-apostles. This was foreseen. I mean, we knew that things would come to this, even without Bernard's presence. At most Bernard will act more effectively than so many of those inept men of the Curia, and the debate with him will necessarily be more subtle. Yes, the abbot said, but at this point we come up against the question raised yesterday. If by tomorrow we have not discovered the person guilty of 2, perhaps 3, crimes, I must allow Bernard to exercise control over the abbey's affairs. I cannot conceal from a man invested with the power Bernard will have, and because of our mutual agreement, we must not forget that here in the abbey inexplicable events have taken place, are still taking place. Otherwise, the moment he finds out, the moment, God forbid, some new mysterious event happens, he will have every right to cry betrayal. True, William murmured, worried. But there is nothing to be done. Perhaps it will be a good thing. Bernard occupied with the assassin will have less time to participate in the debate. Bernard occupied with discovering the murderer will be a thorn in the side of my authority, remember that. This murky business obliges me for the first time to surrender a part of my power within these walls, and it is a new turn in the history not only of this abbey but of the Cluniac order itself. I would do anything to avoid it. Where is Berengar? What has happened to him? What are you doing? I am only a monk who, a long time ago, conducted some effective inquisitorial investigations. You know that the truth is not to be found in 2 days. And after all, what power have you granted me? May I enter the library? May I ask all the questions I'd like, always supported by your authority? I see no connection between the crimes and the library, the abbot said angrily. Adelmo was an illuminator, Venantius a translator, Berengar the assistant librarian. William explained patiently. In this sense all 60 monks have something to do with the library, as they have with the church. Why not investigate the church, then? Brother William, you are conducting an inquiry at my behest and within the limits I have established. For the rest, within this girdle of walls I am the only master after God and by his grace. And this will hold true for Bernard as well. In any event, he added, in a milder tone, Bernard may not necessarily be coming here specifically for the meeting. The abbot of Conques writes me that the Pope has asked Cardinal Bertrand del Paggetto to come up from Bologna and assume command of the papal legation. Perhaps Bernard is coming here to meet the cardinal. Which, in a broader perspective, would be worse. Bertrand is the scourge of heretics in central Italy. This encounter between the two champions of the battle against heretics may herald a vaster offensive in the country, eventually against the whole Franciscan movement. And of this we will promptly inform the emperor, the abbot said, but in this case the danger would not be immediate. We will be alert. Goodbye. William remained silent a moment as the abbot departed. Then he said to me, first of all, Adza, we must try not to let ourselves be overcome by haste. Things cannot be solved rapidly when so many small, individual experiences have to be put together. I am going back to the laboratory, because in addition to keeping me from reading the manuscript, being without my lenses also makes it pointless for me to return tonight to the library. At that moment Nicholas of Morimondo came running toward us, bearer of very bad tidings. While he was trying to grind more finely the best lens, the one on which William had based such hope, it had broken. And another, which could perhaps have replaced it, had cracked as he was trying to insert it into the fork. Nicholas, disconsolately, pointed to the sky. It was already the hour of vespers and darkness was falling. For that day no more work could be done. Another day lost, William acknowledged bitterly, suppressing, as he confessed to me afterward, the temptation to strangle the master glazier, though Nicholas was already sufficiently humiliated. We left him to his humiliation and went to inquire about Berengar. Naturally, no one had found him. We felt we had reached a dead end. We strolled a while in the cloister, uncertain what to do next. But soon I saw William was lost in thought, staring into the air, as if he saw nothing. A bit earlier he had taken from his habit a twig of those herbs that I had seen him gather weeks before, and he was chewing it as if it gave him a kind of calm stimulus. In fact, he seemed absent, but every now and then his eyes brightened as if in the vacuum of his mind a new idea had kindled. Then he would plunge once more into that singular and active habitude of his. All of a sudden he said, of course, we could. What? I asked. I was thinking of a way to get our bearings in the labyrinth. It is not simple, but it would be effective. After all, the exit is in the East Tower. This we know. Now, suppose that we had a machine that tells us where north is. What would happen? Naturally, we would have only to turn to our right and we would be heading east. Or else it would suffice to go in the opposite direction and we would know we were going toward the South Tower. But, even assuming such magic existed, the labyrinth is in fact a labyrinth, and as soon as we headed east we would come upon a wall that would prevent us from going straight, and we would lose our way again. I observed. Yes, but the machine I am talking about would always point north, even if we had changed our route, and at every point it would tell us which way to turn. It would be marvelous. But we would have to have this machine, and it would have to be able to recognize north at night and indoors, without being able to see the sun or the stars. And I believe not even your Bacon possessed such a machine. I laughed. But you are wrong, William said, because a machine of the sort has been constructed, and some navigators have used it. It doesn't need the stars or the sun, because it exploits the power of a marvelous stone, like the one we saw in Severinus's infirmary, the one that attracts iron. And it was studied by Bacon and by a Picard wizard, Pierre of Mericourt, who described its many uses. But could you construct it? In itself, that wouldn't be difficult. The stone can be used to produce many wonders, including a machine that moves perpetually without any external power, but the simplest discovery was described also by an Arab, Balik al-Kabayaki. Take a vessel filled with water and set afloat in it a cork into which you have stuck an iron needle. Then pass the magnetic stone over the surface of the water, until the needle has acquired the same properties as the stone. And at this point the needle, though the stone would also have done it if it had had the capacity to move around a pivot, will turn and point north, and if you move it with the vessel, it will always turn in the direction of the north wind. Obviously, if you bear north in mind and also mark on the edge of the vessel the positions of east, south, and west, you will always know which way to turn in the library to reach the East Tower. What a marvel! I exclaimed. But why does the needle always point north? The stone attracts iron, I saw that, and I imagine that an immense quantity of iron attracts the stone. But then in the direction of the pole star, at the extreme confines of the globe, there exist great iron mines. Someone, in fact, has suggested such is the case. Except that the needle doesn't point precisely in the direction of the day star, but toward the intersection of the celestial meridians. A sign that, as has been said, hic lapis gerit in se similitudinem celi, and the poles of the magnet receive their inclination from the poles of the sky, not from those of the earth. Which is a fine example of movement provoked at a distance, not by direct material causality. A problem that my friend John of Jandon is studying, when the emperor does not ask him to make Avignon sink into the bowels of the earth. Let's go, then, and take Severinus's stone, and a vessel, and some water, and a cork. I said, excited. Wait a moment, William said. I do not know why, but I have never seen a machine that, however perfect in the philosopher's description, is perfect in its mechanical functioning. Whereas a peasant's billhook, which no philosopher has ever described, always functions as it should. I'm afraid that wandering around the labyrinth with a lamp in one hand, a vessel full of water in the other. Wait, though, I have another idea. The machine would point north even if we were outside the labyrinth, would it not? Yes, but at that point it would be of no use to us, because we would have the sun and the stars. I said, I know. But if the machine functions both indoors and outdoors, why should it not be the same with our heads? Our heads? Of course, they also function outside, and in fact, on the outside we know quite well the layout of the edificium. But it is when we are inside that we become disoriented. Precisely. But forget the machine for now. Thinking about the machine has led me to think about natural laws and the laws of thought. Here is the point. We must find, from the outside, a way of describing the edificium as it is inside. But how? We will use the mathematical sciences. Only in the mathematical sciences, as Averroes says, are things known to us identified with those known absolutely. Then you do admit universal notions, you see. Mathematical notions are propositions constructed by our intellect in such a way that they function always as truths, either because they are innate or because mathematics was invented before the other sciences. And the library was built by a human mind that thought in a mathematical fashion, because without mathematics you cannot build labyrinths. And therefore we must compare our mathematical propositions with the propositions of the builder, and from this comparison science can be produced, because it is a science of terms upon terms. And, in any case, stop dragging me into discussions of metaphysics. What the devil has got into you today? Instead, you who have good eyes take a parchment, a tablet, something you can make signs on, and a stylus. Good, you have it? Good for you, Adza. Let's go and take a turn around the edificium while we still have a bit of light. So we took a long turn around the edificium. That is, from the distance we examined the east, south, and west towers, with the walls connecting them. The rest rose over the cliff, though for reasons of symmetry it could not be very different from what we were seeing. And what we saw, William observed as he made me take precise notes on my tablet, was that each wall had 2 windows, and each tower 5. Now, think, my master said to me. Each room we saw had a window. Except those with 7 sides, I said. And, naturally, they are the ones in the center of each tower. And except some others that we found without windows but that were not heptagonal. Forget them. First let us find the rule, then we will try to explain the exceptions. So, we will have on the outside 5 rooms for each tower and 2 rooms for each straight wall, each room with a window. But if from a room with a window we proceed toward the interior of the edificium, we meet another room with a window. A sign that there are internal windows. Now, what shape is the internal well, as seen from the kitchen and from the scriptorium? Octagonal, I said. Excellent. And on each side of the octagon, there could easily be 2 windows. Does this mean that for each side of the octagon there are 2 internal rooms? Am I right? Yes, but what about the windowless rooms? There are 8 in all. In fact, the internal room of every tower, with 7 sides, has 5 walls that open each into one of the 5 rooms of the tower. What do the other 2 walls confine with? Not with rooms set along the outside walls, or there would be windows, and not with rooms along the octagon, for the same reason and because they would then be excessively long rooms. Try to draw a plan of how the library might look from above. You see that in each tower there must be 2 rooms that confine with the heptagonal room and open into 2 rooms that confine with the internal octagonal well. I tried drawing the plan that my master suggested, and I let out a cry of triumph. But now we know everything. Let me count. The library has 56 rooms, 4 of them heptagonal and 52 more or less square, and of these, there are 8 without windows, while 28 look to the outside and 16 to the interior. And the 4 towers each have 5 rooms with 4 walls and 1 with 7. The library is constructed according to a celestial harmony to which various and wonderful meanings can be attributed. A splendid discovery, I said, but why is it so difficult to get our bearings? Because what does not correspond to any mathematical law is the arrangement of the openings. Some rooms allow you to pass into several others, some into only one, and we must ask ourselves whether there are not rooms that do not allow you to go anywhere else. If you consider this aspect, plus the lack of light or of any clue that might be supplied by the position of the sun, and if you add the visions in the mirrors, you understand how the labyrinth can confuse anyone who goes through it, especially when he is already troubled by a sense of guilt. Remember, too, how desperate we were last night when we could no longer find our way. The maximum of confusion achieved with the maximum of order, it seems a sublime calculation. The builders of the library were great masters. How will we orient ourselves, then? At this point it isn't difficult. With the map you've drawn, which should more or less correspond to the plan of the library, as soon as we are the first heptagonal room we will move immediately to reach one of the blind rooms. Then, always turning right, after 2 or 3 rooms we should again be in a tower, which can only be the north tower, until we come to another blind room, on the left, which will confine with the heptagonal room, and on the right will allow us to rediscover a route similar to what I have just described, until we arrive at the west tower. Yes, if all the rooms opened into all the other rooms. In fact, and for this reason we'll need your map, to mark the blank walls on it, so we'll know what detours we're making. But it won't be difficult. But are we sure it will work? I asked, puzzled. It all seemed too simple to me. It will work, William replied. But unfortunately we don't know everything yet. We have learned how to avoid being lost. Now we must know whether there is a rule governing the distribution of the books among the rooms. And the verses from the Apocalypse tell us very little, not least because many are repeated identically in different rooms. And yet in the book of the Apostle they could have found far more than 56 verses. Undoubtedly. Therefore only certain verses are good. Strange. As if they had had fewer than 50, 30 or 20. Oh, by the beard of Merlin. Of whom? Pay no attention. A magician of my country. They used as many verses as there are letters in the alphabet. Of course, that's it. The text of the verse doesn't count, it's the initial letters that count. Each room is marked by a letter of the alphabet, and altogether they make up some text that we must discover. Like a figured poem, in the form of a cross or a fish. More or less, and probably in the period when the library was built, that kind of poem was much in vogue. But where does the text begin? With a scroll larger than the others, in the heptagonal room of the entrance tower, or else? Why, of course, with the sentences in red. But there are so many of them. And therefore there must be many texts, or many words. Now make a better and larger copy of your map. While we visit the library, you will mark down with your stylus the rooms we pass through, the positions of the doors and walls, as well as the windows, and also the first letters of the verses that appear there. And like a good illuminator, you will make the letters in red larger. But how does it happen, I said with admiration, that you were able to solve the mystery of the library looking at it from the outside, and you were unable to solve it when you were inside? Thus God knows the world, because he conceived it in his mind, as if from the outside, before it was created, and we do not know its rule, because we live inside it, having found it already made. So one can know things by looking at them from the outside. The creations of art, because we retrace in our minds the operations of the artificer. Not the creations of nature, because they are not the work of our minds. But for the library this suffices, doesn't it? Yes, William said, but only for the library. Now let's go and rest. I can do nothing until tomorrow morning, when I will have, I hope, my lenses. We might as well sleep, and rise early. I will try to reflect. And supper? Ah, of course, supper. The hour has passed by now. The monks are already at Compline. But perhaps the kitchen is still open. Go look for something. And steal it? Ask. Ask Salvatore, who is now your friend. But he will steal. Are you perhaps your brother's keeper? William asked, with the words of Cain. But I saw he was joking and meant to say that God is great and merciful. And so I went looking for Salvatore and found him near the horses' stalls. A fine animal, I said, nodding at Brunellus as a way of starting a conversation. I would like to ride him. No se puede. Abanus est. But you do not need a pulcher horse to ride hard. He pointed out a sturdy but ill-favored horse. That one also sufficit. Vid illic, tertius equi. He wanted to point out to me the third horse. I laughed at his comical Latin. And what will you do with that one? I asked him, and he told me a strange story. He said that any horse, even the oldest and weakest animal, could be made as swift as Brunellus. You had only to mix into his oats an herb called satyrion, chopped fine, and then grease his thighs with stag fat. Then you mount the horse, and before spurring him you turn his face eastward and you whisper into his ear, 3 times, the words, Nicander, Melchior, and Melchizard, and the horse will dash off and will go as far in 1 hour as Brunellus would in 8. And if you hang around his neck the teeth of a wolf that the horse himself has trampled and killed, the animal will not even feel the effort. I asked him whether he had ever tried this. He said to me, coming closer circumspectly and whispering into my ear with his really foul breath, that it was very difficult, because satyrion was now cultivated only by bishops and by their lordly friends, who used it to increase their power. Then I put an end to his talk and told him that this evening my master wanted to read certain books in his cell and wished to eat up there. I will do, he said, I will do cheese in batter. How is that made? Facilis. You take the cheese before it is too antiquum, without too much solace, and cut in cubes or sicut you like. And postea you put a bit of butero or lardo to recoffer over the embers. And in it you put 2 pieces of cheese, and when it becomes tenero, zuccherum et cinnamon suprapositorum do bis. And immediately take to table, because it must be ate caldo. Cheese in batter it is, then, I said to him. And he vanished toward the kitchen, telling me to wait for him. He arrived half an hour later with a dish covered by a cloth. The aroma was good. Here, he said to me, and he also held out a great lamp filled with oil. What for? I asked. C'est pas moi, he said, slyly. Payed etre your magister wants to go in dark place esta noche. Salvatore apparently knew more things than I had suspected. I inquired no further, but took the food to William. We ate, and I withdrew to my cell. Or at least, so I implied. I wanted to find Ubertino again, and stealthily I returned to the church. After Compline, in which Ubertino tells Adza the story of Fra Dolcino, after which Adza recalls other stories or reads them on his own in the library, and then he has an encounter with a maiden, beautiful and terrible as an army arrayed for battle. I found Ubertino at the statue of the Virgin. Silently I joined him and for a while pretended, I confess, to pray. Then I made bold to speak to him. Holy Father, I said to him, may I ask enlightenment and counsel of you? Ubertino looked at me and, taking me by the hand, rose and led me to a bench, where we both sat. He embraced me tightly, and I could feel his breath on my face. Dearest son, he said, anything this poor sinner can do for your soul will be done joyfully. What is distressing you? Yearnings? He asked, almost with yearning himself. The yearnings of the flesh? No, I replied, blushing, if anything the yearnings of the mind, which wants to know too many things. And that is bad. The Lord knows all things, and we must only adore his knowledge. But we must also distinguish good from evil and understand human passions. I am a novice, but I will be monk and priest, and I must learn where evil lies, and what it looks like, in order to recognize it one day and teach others to recognize it. This is true, my boy. What do you want to know, then? The terror of heresy, father, I said with conviction. And then, all in one breath, I have heard tell of a wicked man who has led others astray, Fra Dolcino. Ubertino remained silent, then he said, that is right, you heard brother William and me refer to him the other evening. But it is a nasty story, and it grieves me to talk about it, because it teaches, yes, in this sense you should know it, to derive a useful lesson from it, because, I was saying, it teaches how the love of penance and the desire to purify the world can produce bloodshed and slaughter. He shifted his position on the bench, relaxing his grasp of my shoulders but still keeping one hand on my neck, as if to communicate to me his knowledge or, I could not tell, his intensity. The story begins before Fra Dolcino, he said, more than 60 years ago, when I was a child. It was in Parma. There a certain Gherardo Sigarelli began preaching, exhorting all to a life of penitence, and he would go along the roads crying, penitentia, which was the uneducated man's way of saying, penitentiam agite, apropinquibit enim regnum coelorum. He enjoined his disciples to imitate the apostles, and he chose to call his sect the Order of the Apostles, and his men were to go through the world like poor beggars, living only on alms. Like the Fraticelli, I said. Wasn't this the command of our Lord and of your own Francis? Yes, Ubertino admitted with a slight hesitation in his voice, sighing. But perhaps Gherardo exaggerated. He and his followers were accused of denying the authority of the priests in the celebration of Mass and confession, and of being idle vagabonds. But the spiritual Franciscans were accused of the same thing. And aren't the Minorites saying today that the authority of the Pope should not be recognized? Yes, but not the authority of priests. We Minorites are ourselves priests. It is difficult, boy, to make distinctions in these things. The line dividing good from evil is so fine. In some way Gherardo erred and became guilty of heresy. He asked to be admitted to the order of the Minorites, but our brothers would not receive him. He spent his days in the church of our brothers, and he saw the paintings there of the apostles wearing sandals on their feet and cloaks wrapped around their shoulders, and so he let his hair and beard grow, put sandals on his feet, and wore the robe of the friars minor, because anyone who wants to found a new congregation always takes something from the order of the Blessed Francis. Then he was in the right. But somewhere he did wrong. Dressed in a white cloak over a white tunic, with his hair long, he acquired among simple people the reputation for saintliness. He sold a little house of his, and having received the money, he stood on a stone from which in ancient times the magistrates were accustomed to harangue, and he held the little sack of gold pieces in his hand, and he did not scatter them or give them to the poor, but, after summoning some rogues dicing nearby, he flung the money in their midst and said, "Let him take who will," and those rogues took the money and went off to gamble it away, and they blasphemed the living God, and he who had given to them heard and did not blush. But Francis also stripped himself of everything, and today from William the First heard that he went to preach to ravens and hawks, as well as to the lepers, namely, to the dregs that the people who call themselves virtuous had cast out. Yes, but Gherardo somehow erred. Francis never set himself in conflict with the Holy Church, and the Gospel says to give to the poor, not to rogues. Gherardo gave and received nothing in return because he had given to bad people, and he had a bad beginning, a bad continuation, and a bad end, because his congregation was disapproved by Pope Gregory X. Perhaps, I said, he was a less broad-minded pope than the one who approved the rule of Francis. He was, but Gherardo somehow erred, and Francis, on the contrary, knew well what he was doing. And finally, boy, these keepers of pigs and cows who suddenly became pseudo-apostles wanted to live blissfully and without sweat off the alms of those whom the friars minor had educated with such efforts and such heroic examples of poverty. But that is not the point, he added promptly. The point is that to resemble the apostles, who had still been Jews, Gherardo Sigarelli had himself circumcised, which is contrary to the words of Paul to the Galatians. And you know that many holy persons proclaim that the future Antichrist will come from the race of the circumcised. But Gerardo did still worse. He went about collecting the simple people and saying, "Come with me into the vineyard," and those who did not know him went with him into another's vineyard, believing it his, and they ate another's grapes. "Surely the Minorites didn't defend private property," I said impertinently. Ubertino stared at me severely. "The Minorites ask to be poor, but they have never asked others to be poor. You cannot attack the property of good Christians with impunity. The good Christians will label you a bandit." And so it happened to Gerardo. They said of him finally that to test his strength of will and his continence he slept with women without having carnal knowledge of them. But when his disciples tried to imitate him, the results were quite different. Oh, these are not things a boy should know. The female is a vessel of the devil. And then they began to brawl among themselves over the command of the sect, and evil things happened. And yet many came to Gerardo, not only peasants, but also people of the city, members of the guilds, and Gerardo made them strip themselves so that, naked, they could follow the naked Christ, and he sent them out into the world to preach. But he had a sleeveless tunic made for himself, white, of strong stuff, and in this garb he looked more like a clown than like a religious. They lived in the open air, but sometimes they climbed into the pulpits of the churches, disturbing the assembly of devout folk and driving out their preachers, and once they set a child on the bishop's throne in the church of Santorso in Ravenna. And they proclaimed themselves heirs of the doctrine of Joachim of Flores. "But so did the Franciscans," I said, "and also Gerard of Borgo San Donino, and you, too." I cried. "Calm yourself, boy. Joachim of Flores was a great prophet, and he was the first to understand that Francis would begin a renewal of the church. But the pseudo-apostles used his doctrine to justify their follies. Sigarelli took with him a female apostle, one Tripia Aripia, who claimed to have the gift of prophecy. A woman, you understand? But, father, I tried to counter. The other evening you yourself spoke of the saintliness of Clare of Montefalco and Angela of Foligno. They were saints. They lived in humility, recognizing the power of the church. They never claimed the gift of prophecy. But the pseudo-apostles asserted that women could go preaching from city to city, as many other heretics also said. And they recognized no difference among the wed and the unwed, nor was any vow considered perpetual. In short, not to weary you too much with very sad stories whose subtleties you cannot understand well, Bishop Obizo of Parma finally decided to put Gerardo in irons. But here a strange thing happened that tells you how weak is human nature, and how insidious the weed of heresy. Because in the end the bishop freed Gerardo and received him at his own table, and laughed at his japes, and kept him as his buffoon. But why? I do not know, or, rather, I fear I do know. The bishop was a nobleman and did not like the merchants and craftsmen of the city. Perhaps he did not mind Gerardo's preaching against them with his talk of poverty, or did not care that from begging for alms Gerardo proceeded to robbery. But in the end the Pope intervened, and the bishop resumed his proper 70, and Gerardo ended on the pyre as an impenitent heretic. It was at the beginning of this century. And what do these things have to do with Fra Dolcino? They are connected, and this shows you how heresy survives even the destruction of the heretics. This Dolcino was a priest's bastard, living in the Novara diocese, this part of Italy, a bit farther north. He was a youth of sharp mind and he was educated in letters, but he stole from the priest who housed him and fled eastward, to the city of Trent. And there he resumed the preaching of Gerardo, but in a more heretical vein, declaring that he was the only true apostle of God and that everything should be common in love, and that it was licit to lie indiscriminately with all women, whereby no one could be accused of concubinage, even if he went with both a wife and a daughter. Did he truly preach those things, or was he just accused of preaching them? I have heard that the spirituals, like those monks of Montefalco, were accused of similar crimes. De hoc satis, Ubertino interrupted me sharply. They were no longer monks. They were heretics, and befouled by Fra Dolcino himself. And, furthermore, listen to me. It is enough to know what Fra Dolcino did afterward to call him a wicked man. How he became familiar with the pseudo-apostles' teachings, I do not even know. Perhaps he went through Parma as a youth and heard Gerardo. It is known that in the Bologna region he kept in touch with those heretics after Sigarelli's death. And it is known for certain that he began his preaching at Trent. There he seduced a very beautiful maiden of noble family, Margaret, or she seduced him, as Heloise seduced Abelard, because, never forget, it is through woman that the devil penetrates men's hearts. At that point, the Bishop of Trent drove him from the diocese, but by then Dolcino had gathered more than 1,000 followers, and he began a long march, which took him back to the area where he was born. And along the way other deluded folk joined him, seduced by his words, and perhaps he was also joined by many Waldensian heretics who lived in the mountains he passed through, or he himself wanted to join the Waldensians of these lands to the north. When he reached the Novara region, Dolcino found a situation favorable to his revolt, caused the vassals governing the town of Gattinara in the name of the Bishop of Vercelli had been driven out by the populace, who then welcomed Dolcino's outlaws as their worthy allies. What had the bishop's vassals done? I do not know, and it is not my place to judge. But as you see, heresy in many cases is wed to the revolt against overlords, and this is why the heretic begins by preaching Madonna poverty and then falls prey to all the temptations of power, war, violence. There was a conflict among certain families in the city of Vercelli, and the pseudo-apostles took advantage of it, and these families exploited the disorder brought by the pseudo-apostles. The feudal lords hired mercenaries to rob the citizens, and the citizens sought the protection of the Bishop of Novara. What a complicated story. But whose side was Dolcino on? I do not know. He was a faction unto himself. He entered into all these disputes and saw them as an opportunity for preaching the struggle against private ownership in the name of poverty. Dolcino and his followers, who were now 3,000 strong, camped on a hill near Novara known as Bald Mountain, and they built hovels and fortifications, and Dolcino ruled over that whole throng of men and women, who lived in the most shameful promiscuity. From there he sent letters to his faithful in which he expounded his heretical doctrine. He said and he wrote that their ideal was poverty and they were not bound by any vow of external obedience, and that he, Dolcino, had been sent by God to break the seals of the prophecies and to understand the writings of the Old and the New Testaments. And he called secular clerics, preachers and minorites, ministers of the devil, and he absolved everyone from the duty of obeying them. And he identified 4 ages in the life of the people of God. The first was that of the Old Testament, the patriarchs and prophets, before the coming of Christ, when marriage was good because God's people had to multiply. The second was the age of Christ and the apostles, and this was the epoch of saintliness and chastity. Then came the third, when the popes had first to accept earthly riches in order to govern the people, but when mankind began to stray from the love of God, Benedict came, and spoke against all temporal possessions. When the monks of Benedict also then went back to accumulating wealth, the monks of St. Francis and St. Dominic came, even more stern than Benedict in preaching against earthly power and riches. But finally now, when again the lives of so many prelates were contradicting all those good precepts, we had reached the end of the third age, and it was necessary to follow the teachings of the apostles. Then Dolcino was preaching the things that the Franciscans had preached, and among the Franciscans, the spirituals in particular, and you yourself, Father. Ah, yes, but he derived a perfidious syllogism from them. He said that to bring to an end this third age of corruption, all the clergy, monks, and friars had to die a very cruel death. He said that all prelates of the church, all clerics, nuns, religious male and female, all those who belonged to the preaching orders and the minorites, the hermits, and even Boniface the Pope had to be exterminated by the emperor he, Dolcino, had chosen, and this was to be Frederick of Sicily. But didn't that same Frederick receive with favor in Sicily the spirituals expelled from Umbria, and isn't it the minorites who ask that the emperor, though he is now Louis, destroy the temporal power of the Pope and the cardinals? It is characteristic of heresy or of madness, that it transforms the most upright thoughts and aims them at consequences contrary to the law of God and man. The minorites have never asked the emperor to kill other priests. He was mistaken, I know now. Because, a few months later, when the Bavarian established his own order in Rome, Marsilius and other minorites did to religious who were faithful to the Pope exactly what Dolcino had asked to have done. By this I don't mean that Dolcino was right. If anything, Marsilius was equally wrong. But I was beginning to wonder, especially after that afternoon's conversation with William, if it were possible for the simple people who followed Dolcino to distinguish between the promises of the spirituals and Dolcino's enactment of them. Was he not perhaps guilty of putting into practice what presumably orthodox men had preached, in a purely mystical fashion? Or was that perhaps where the difference lay? Did holiness consist to waiting for God to give us what his saints had promised, without trying to obtain it through earthly means? Now I know this is the case and I know why Dolcino was in error. The order of things must not be transformed, even if we must fervently hope for its transformation. But that evening I was in the grip of contradictory thoughts. Finally, Ubertino was saying to me, you always find the mark of heresy in pride. In a second letter, to the year 1303, Dolcino appointed himself supreme head of the apostolic congregation, and named as his lieutenants the perfidious Margaret, a woman, and Longinus of Bergamo, Frederick of Novara, Albert Carantinus, and Walderic of Brescia. And he began raving about a sequence of future popes, 2 good, the first and the last, and 2 wicked, the second and the third. The first is Celestine, the second is Boniface VIII, of whom the prophets say, the pride of your heart has dishonored you, O you who live in the fissures of cliffs. The third pope is not named, but of him Jeremiah is supposed to have said, there, like a lion. And, infamy. Dolcino recognized the lion in Frederick of Sicily. For Dolcino the 4th pope was still unknown, and he was to be the sainted pope, the angelic pope of whom the abbot Joachim spoke. He would be chosen by God, and then Dolcino and all his people, who at this point were already 4,000, would receive together the grace of the Holy Spirit, and it would renew the church until the end of the world. But in the 3 years preceding his coming, all evil would have to be consummated. And this Dolcino tried to do, carrying war everywhere. And the 4th pope, and here you see how the devil mocks his familiars, was in fact Clement V, who proclaimed the crusade against Dolcino. And it was right, because in his letters at this point Dolcino sustained theories that could not be reconciled with orthodoxy. He declared the Roman Church a whore, said that obedience is not due priests, that all spiritual power had now passed to the sect of the apostles, that only the apostles represented the new church, the apostles could annul matrimony, no one would be saved unless he was a member of the sect, no pope could absolve sin, tithes should not be paid, a more perfect life was lived without vows than with vows, and a consecrated church was worthless for prayer, no better than a stable, and Christ could be worshipped both in the woods and in the churches. Did he really say these things? Of course, this is certain. He wrote them, but unfortunately he did still worse. After he had settled on Bald Mountain, he began sacking the villages in the valley, raiding them to procure provisions, waging outright war, in short, against the nearby towns. Were all opposed to him? We do not know. Perhaps he received support from some. I told you that he had involved himself in the snarled knot of local dissensions. Meanwhile winter had come, the winter of the year 1305, one of the harshest in recent decades, and there was great famine all around. Dolcino sent a third letter to his followers, and many more joined him, but on that hill life had become intolerable, and they are so hungry that they ate the flesh of horses and other animals, and boiled hay. And many died. But whom were they fighting against now? The Bishop of Vercelli had appealed to Clement V, and a crusade had been called against the heretics. A plenary indulgence was granted to anyone taking part in it, and Louis of Savoy, the inquisitors of Lombardy, the Archbishop of Milan were prompt to act. Many took up the cross to aid the people of Vercelli and Novara, even from Savoy, Provence, France, and the Bishop of Vercelli was the supreme commander. There were constant clashes between the vanguards of the two armies, but Dolcino's fortifications were impregnable, and somehow the wicked received help. From whom? From other wicked men, I believe, who were happy to foment this disorder. Toward the end of the year 1305, the heresiarch was forced, however, to abandon Bald Mountain, leaving behind the wounded and ill, and he moved into the territory of Trevero, where he entrenched himself on a mountain that was called Zubello at the time and later was known as Rebello or Rebello, because it had become the fortress of the rebels of the church. In any case, I cannot tell you everything that happened. There were terrible massacres, but in the end the rebels were forced to surrender, Dolcino and his people were captured, and they rightly ended up on the pyre. The beautiful Margaret, too? Ubertino looked at me. So you remembered she was beautiful? She was beautiful, they say, and many local lords tried to make her their bride to save her from the stake. But she would not have it. She died impenitent with her impenitent lover. And let this be a lesson to you. Beware of the whore of Babylon, even when she assumes the form of the most exquisite creature. But now tell me, Father, I have learned that the cellarer of the convent, and perhaps also Salvatore, met Dolcino and were with him in some way. Be silent. Do not utter rash statements. I found the cellarer in a convent of Minorites. I do not know where Remigio had been before that. I know he was always a good monk, at least from the standpoint of orthodoxy. As for the rest, alas, the flesh is weak. What do you mean? These are not things you should know. He drew me close again, embracing me and pointing to the statue of the Virgin. You must be introduced to the Immaculate Love. There is she in whom femininity is sublimated. This is why you may call her beautiful, like the beloved in the Song of Songs. In her, he said, his face carried away by an inner rapture, like the abbot's the day before when he spoke of gems and the gold of his vessels. In her, even the body's grace is a sign of the beauties of heaven, and this is why the sculptor has portrayed her with all the graces that should adorn a woman. He pointed to the Virgin's slender bust, held high and tight by a cross-laced bodice, which the child's tiny hands fondled. You see? As the doctors have said, beautiful also are the breasts, which protrude slightly, only faintly tumescent, and do not swell licentiously, suppressed but not depressed. What do you feel before this sweetest of visions? I blushed violently, feeling myself stirred as if by an inner fire. Ubertino must have realized it, or perhaps he glimpsed my flushed cheeks, for he promptly added, but you must learn to distinguish the fire of supernatural love from the raving of the senses. It is difficult even for the saints. But how can the good love be recognized? I asked, trembling. What is love? There is nothing in the world, neither man nor devil nor anything, that I hold as suspect as love, for it penetrates the soul more than any other thing. Nothing exists that so fills and binds the heart as love does. Therefore, unless you have those weapons that subdue it, the soul plunges through love into an immense abyss. And I believe that without Margaret's seductions Dolcino would not have damned himself, and without the reckless and promiscuous life on Bald Mountain, fewer would have felt the lure of his rebellion. Mind you, I do not say these things to you only about evil love, which of course all must shun as a thing of the devil. I say this also, and with great fear, of the good love between God and man, between man and his neighbor. It often happens that 2 or 3 people, men or women, love one another quite cordially and harbor reciprocal, special fondness, and desire to live always close, and what one party wishes, the other desires. And I confess that I felt something of the kind for most virtuous women, like Angela and Claire. Well, that, too, is blameworthy, even though it is spiritual and conceived in God's name. Because even the love felt by the soul, if it is not forearmed, if it is felt warmly, then falls, or proceeds in disorder. Oh, love has various properties. First the soul grows tender, then it sickens, but then it feels the true warmth of divine love and cries out and moans and becomes as stone flung in the forge to melt into lime, and it crackles, licked by the flame. And this is good love? Ubertino stroked my head, and as I looked at him, I saw his eyes melt with tears. Yes, this, finally, is good love. He took his hand from my shoulder. But how difficult it is, he added, how difficult it is to distinguish it from the other. And sometimes when devils tempt your soul you feel like the man hanged by the neck who, with his hands tied behind him and his eyes blindfolded, remains hanging on the gallows and yet lives, with no help, no support, no remedy, swinging in the empty air. His face was bathed not only with tears but also by a faint perspiration. Go now, he said to me quickly. I have told you what you wanted to know, on this side the choir of angels, on that, the gaping maw of hell. Go, and the Lord be praised. He prostrated himself again before the Virgin, and I heard him sobbing softly. He was praying. I did not leave the church. The talk with Ubertino had kindled in my spirit, and in my viscera, a strange fire and an unspeakable restlessness. Perhaps for this reason, I felt inclined to disobedience and decided to return to the library alone. I myself didn't know what I was looking for. I wanted to explore an unknown place on my own. I was fascinated by the idea of being able to orient myself there without my master's help. I climbed the stairs as Dolcino had climbed up Monte Ribello. I had the lamp with me. Why had I brought it? Was I perhaps already harboring this secret plan? And I entered the ossarium almost with my eyes closed. In no time I was in the scriptorium. It was a fatal evening, I believe, because as I was wandering among the desks, I glimpsed one on which lay an open manuscript that a monk had been copying. Historia Fratris Dulcini Heresiarchi. I believe it was the desk of Peter of Sant'Albano, who I had been told was writing a monumental history of heresy. After what happened in the abbey, he naturally gave up writing it, but we must not get ahead of the story. So it was therefore normal that the text should be there, and with it others on kindred subjects, on the Paterines and the Flagellants. But I took this circumstance as a supernatural sign, whether celestial or diabolical I still cannot say, and I bent eagerly to read the writing. It was not very long, and I found there also what Ubertino had not told me, obviously recounted by one who had seen all and whose imagination was still inflamed by it.